Hello, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are here. We're going to get started in just a minute. We'll give people a little bit of time to join, so just hold tight. But thank you for being here. All right, I see people are still trickling in, but I think since we're 2 minutes past our designated start time, we'll get started here. So my name is Sam Savitz. I'm an analyst at the Energy Futures Initiative. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We had so many RSVPs that we had to upgrade our Zoom subscription, so thanks for that. I'd like to extend a special thanks to our sponsors on this project, the Linden Trust for Conservation and the Climate Works Foundation. Thank you for all your help with this. So to give you a bit of background, in 2019, EFI released our first report, Clearing the Air, about carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions technologies. And in the wake of that report, we decided to do a follow-up project focusing on underexplored options for CDR, for carbon dioxide removal. So there are 3 reports in this series, which we call Frontiers of CDR, and they should be out now on EFI's website. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to go through the agenda for this afternoon. So first, we'll have remarks from former Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz. Then remarks from EFI Managing Principal Joe Hezir, who was the lead for this project. And then we'll have presentations from co-leads who led the workshops that went into each of these reports, followed by a Q&A session. And for that Q&A, please use the Q&A function in Zoom and then the chat function for talking to your fellow viewers. And then following that, we'll have a panel hosted by Michael Corin of Quartz with some outside experts talking about the future of CDR in a Biden-Harris administration. And we should wrap up by about 3 o'clock. So without further ado, let me hand it over to the former Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz, the founder and CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative.
Well, thank you, Sam. And also thank you again. I'll repeat Sam's thanks to our friends at the Linden Trust and Climate Works Foundation, and certainly to all of you who have tuned in to listen to this presentation. Now, as Sam mentioned, we did issue a significant report last September during Climate Week 2019. That is, on carbon dioxide removal. And I would just say that the increasing attention that is being given to the need to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees, to reach net zero by mid-century, and frankly, to go on to a net negative economy in the future, really has kept our interest in CDR very, very intense and growing, leading in fact to today's discussion about 3 new reports in the areas of terrestrial, ocean, and mineralization pathways. Those were 3 of the pathways in last year's broad portfolio of RD and D needs that was spelled out. These are areas where, again, we're talking gigaton scale, as you will hear, and great promise, but not enough attention in our view to date, and certainly an opportunity for much more research, development, and demonstration in the years ahead. I'm sure most people on this call understand very well net zero. This cartoon is kind of sketching it out. The green showing greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The tan showing that there is likely to be some residual emissions. Don't worry about scale here. This is just a cartoon, but that those emissions can be both canceled out to net zero by negative carbon emissions technologies, and in fact go beyond canceling to, as I said earlier, net negative. It's clear that, in my view, it's clear that we need to aim to net negative. And once one says that, of course, then it's a tautology that one needs negative carbon technologies, which really brings us to CDR, addressing essentially the CO2 and potentially other greenhouse gas emissions that have been emitted since industrialization, frankly, and need to be addressed for the future that we want. Now, clearly, this is going to require a lot of innovation. In the Clearing the Air report of last year, of 2019, the estimate is about $11 billion over the next 10 years. Not a negligible amount, but neither is it an amount that, in our view, should dissuade us from pursuing these absolutely critical pathways for the future. We're pleased that there's been a significant amount of interest being shown in the political world about advancing this program. We hope it'll be advanced fast enough, but certainly in terms of having caught the attention, I think, of policymakers in Congress, for example, it's really quite encouraging. So that all led, again, as I said, to pursuing these three particular areas with a drill down. You'll hear much more about this from Joe Hezir and from some of the co-chairs of the panels, and I think the best, frankly, is to move straight to Joe so that we can dive into the specifics of how these three pathways can again reach gigaton scale with adequate RD, ND, that is demonstration, in this decade, because this is the decade where we have to go all out to have our options developed for scaling in, say, the 2030 to 2050 time period. So again, thank you all for joining. And with that, I'll be turning it over to our partner, Joe Hezir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to take one moment here to talk a little bit about our report from last September entitled Clearing the Air, which was really our first major report on CDR. And just this one slide here, and I think many of you may have seen or heard about the report, so I won't go into details. But on this one slide here, I just want to highlight a couple of points here that I think are very relevant to the discussion that we're about to have. First is, I think, when thinking about carbon dioxide removal, the scope is very broad. And so it really draws on the expertise of a number of federal agencies. And so I'm thinking about a federal RD&D initiative. In our first report, we identified 10 research agencies plus 2 White House agencies that would be involved in this. The second point is that we wanted to make is regarding the funding. Right now, what we found is that in the current baseline, there's very little funding that is really directly earmarked for carbon dioxide removal. And so that really led us to our recommendation that in order to really scale these alternatives up and to do it within the next 10 years, we really needed a major investment and came up with this estimate of 10.7 billion. The third point is that because of its breadth, we believe that the portfolio really needed to be initially be very broad. There, in our view, is no one single silver bullet, and right now it's too early to claim who might be the winners or losers. And so we identified 4 major pathways, 2 disposition pathways, and some very important cross-cutting issues, and developed a portfolio of 27 elements. And then the last point is, because of the complexity and interplay of all of these factors, we felt that there was a need for a very strong high-level coordination effort. And we're pleased to see that there have been some efforts now in Congress to develop legislation along these lines. So that was kind of the baseline really for the current effort. And as Sam and the Secretary indicated, we wanted to do a deeper dive in 3 of these areas down at the bottom: the terrestrial, biological, mineralization, and coastal and oceans. And to do that, we decided on going into a workshop process, and we organized workshops around those 3 areas, and we were able to very fortunately get volunteer effort from over 75 leading scientific experts to bring to the table their best ideas here for the best CDR opportunities, the challenges, and the priorities. So with that, what we'd like to do now is go through the 3 areas, and basically what I want to do is turn it over to one of the co-chairs of each of the 3 to kind of brief you all on what that workshop, the ideas that came out of those workshops. So let me start first with the workshop on marine CDR. If you can go to the next slide, Natalie. And that briefing will be provided by Brad Ack, who, along with Greg Rao, were the co-chairs of that workshop effort. Brad has had a very long and distinguished career, not only as an oceans researcher, but also as a practitioner in oceans restoration, and also as a leading oceans policy expert. He's currently the executive director and the chief innovation officer for Oceans Vision, which is a partnership of research, academic institutions, investors, innovators, and practitioners. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brad, and let you talk a little bit about what your group found.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that introduction. And hello, everybody. Thank you to EFI to start for being a leader in this space and helping to move forward this critical conversation about carbon dioxide removal. And I also want to thank my co-chair, Greg Rao, who was mentioned. Greg is a scientist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and provided enormous leadership in bringing this report to fruition. So I also want to thank this expert panel. We had really tremendous participation from a broad array of disciplines, institutions, and perspectives, and people were very willing to and generous with their time. So thanks to all of you for helping make this happen. Now, we heard at the beginning of the need for CDR, and I think the case is absolutely clear. But in the case of the oceans, that case hasn't been made quite as clearly. And the job of our panel really was to explore the potential and possibilities of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And I think we came to the conclusion that there is significant potential that needs to be further explored. The first reason for that is really quite obvious. The ocean already plays an outsized role in cycling carbon from the atmosphere and the land through the ocean into the deep ocean, and in fact storing a significant amount of carbon in the deep ocean. Currently, there's about 50 times more carbon in the deep ocean than there is in the atmosphere. And so given just the sheer size of the ocean and the fact that it already plays these functions, there is enormous potential to enhance and possibly accelerate some of these functions to capture and store more carbon. But the less obvious reasons, perhaps, for ocean-based CDR are the fact that the concentration of atmospheric greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is literally driving enormous, dangerous change in the oceans. There are two key parts to that change that is being driven by atmospheric carbon. One is thermal stress, otherwise known as ocean warming. And we talk we let this statistic roll off our tongues of the ocean has absorbed 93% of all the heat trapped in the atmosphere from carbon pollution, but we don't truly grasp the magnitude of that heat. The Chinese Academy of Sciences did an attempt to quantify that recently, and it comes out to about 5 to 6 Hiroshima bomb equivalents of heat energy going into the ocean every second of every minute of every day. That's the amount of extra heat we're putting into the ocean. And it has enormous knock-on dangerous effects that you can see over here on the right. This is literally a slow-moving natural disaster in the oceans, and it really gets very little attention. The second significant stress as a result of atmospheric CO2 concentration is ocean acidification, chemical stress. And this is the fact that some of that carbon pollution that we're putting up into the atmosphere is actually settling onto the ocean surface and being absorbed into the ocean. And as a result, oceans are about 30% more acidic today than they were before the Industrial Revolution. So these two stresses combined, again, are probably the most existential threats to the oceans that we face. And yet they have no solution other than removing atmospheric carbon, atmospheric greenhouse gases. There is no other way to fix these problems. We can potentially ameliorate them, but we cannot fix them without reversing the concentration buildup of CO2. That's where ocean CDR can play a critical role. So what is ocean-based CDR? Basically, it's an attempt to mimic both biomimic and geomimic the processes that the ocean already employs to capture and store carbon. And you know, I referred to a couple of these, but I want to just go over some of the big categories. So first you have marine biomass, and that can be large-scale biomass like kelp and seaweeds, or it can be small plants like phytoplankton. But basically, this is the equivalent of the Trillion Trees Initiative. Grow more biomass in the ocean to capture and store carbon. And there's a number of sub pathways here, but there's one around macroalgae, which is intentionally cultivating seaweed at much larger scales and in the open ocean to capture and store carbon, as well as to create interesting and useful co-products. Second is microalgae, to essentially foster the bloom of microalgae, phytoplankton, by fertilizing the ocean, either by adding material to the ocean or upwelling deep water with nutrients. And the third category, or the third subcategory here, is what's called coastal blue carbon, which is essentially the ecosystems at the ocean front, the ocean-land interface, that have been very effective at capturing and storing carbon. These are critical ecosystems for a variety of reasons, but the report finds pretty clearly not so much as a major contributor to CDR. The other two, much more so. And then you have a second category of ocean carbon dioxide removal, which is called alkalinization. And this mimics more the geologic processes. And this is essentially adding either natural or synthetic alkaline material to the ocean. So natural would be things like limestone or olivine, which essentially react with seawater to remove carbon dioxide in a fairly complex chemical process that I won't try to describe in a short time frame here. But there is enormous potential to further develop and explore this pathway. The third big domain is essentially the ocean equivalent of direct air capture. So this is directly capturing CO2 from seawater using electrochemistry and other methods to forcibly separate CO2 out of seawater and take that stream and do other things with it. So one of the really interesting findings of the report was that all of these all of these different ocean pathways, while they offer really tremendous potential opportunity for carbon dioxide removal, they also have some really interesting and significant potential co-benefits. And I am sorry, the slides seem to be advancing by themselves, but these include things like the production of carbon neutral or carbon negative food, fiber, and energy resources, the potential benefits to production of food, of shellfish and finfish in terms of the way that these operations might be sited to enhance shellfish and finfish production, the creation of improved habitat for other marine organisms, the localized amelioration of ocean acidification. So while we have the big prize of ameliorating it by reducing atmospheric carbon, you can also have localized effects by reduction of carbon in the water or increase of alkalinity in the water. And likewise with thermal stress, you can have local effects on reducing thermal stress in how you site different ocean-based carbon dioxide removal pathways. And then there's the possibility also of remediating nutrients because, for example, marine macroalgae can take up large quantities of nutrients, which is a significant pollution problem that we face in the oceans. And there are other co-benefits as well. Many of them are explored in the report. So given the CDR potential and given the co-benefits, the panel was pretty unanimous in believing that we really need to go deep and long on research, development, and demonstration in ocean-based CDR. The broad recommendation that you'll see in the report calls for $2 billion over the next decade to fund an interagency federal RD&D initiative. Specifically, we think that a lion's share of the money really has to go into the research, development, and demonstration of these specific pathways. And again, there are many of these pathways, but they all require additional technology development and engineering and optimization. And most importantly, they all require moving into field testing as quickly as possible for the proof of concepts that are going to be so needed to attract more energy, attention, and talent into this space. Along with that, we have to improve our methods for measuring and verifying the carbon dioxide removal, the ecosystem effects, positive and negative, and all the life cycle analysis that has to be done to know that we're having a net positive effect. Along with that, we need to improve our modeling capabilities. The ocean is a very, very complex place to work, and we need the most sophisticated and advanced modeling tools to help site ocean-based carbon dioxide removal technologies and to operate them. There's a real important recommendation around really building and enhancing the markets for these co-products that come from ocean-based CDR pathways, because these are going to change the economic equation to make ocean-based CDR even more economically viable. We have to bring the public along with us. There is innate reticence to large-scale activities in the ocean, and we have to turn the dialogue around how this is, in fact, ocean conservation and ocean recovery. And finally, we really need enabling regulatory frameworks, and the report is pretty clear about recommending some interagency structures that can move this along, led by NOAA, Department of Energy, and others. So just a few concluding thoughts. Going to repeat myself, but CDR is an absolute imperative. We have to have it. We need to massify it. This is not a sidelight here. This has got to be something that becomes central to our climate response. Ocean pathways have enormous potential and they merit a lot more attention. Government can play an amazing and important leadership role in doing this to help accelerate the field. And we've got to not just focus on stabilizing, but reversing the climate damage. Just as the Secretary said, we need to go negative. And if we don't do it, who will? And if we don't do it now, then when? Thank you, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Brad. That was a great overview. So I want to move on now to go to the second group that we commissioned in terms of workshops. And this one had to do with carbon mineralization. And this effort was led by Sasha Wilson, along with Don DePaulo. And Sasha will give the presentation. She currently is a professor and as well as serving as the Canada Research Chair in Biogeochemistry of Sustainable Mineral Resources at the University of Alberta, and has a long record of research experience in the carbon mineralization area. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sasha.
Thanks for that introduction, Joe. To start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my co-chair, Don DePaulo from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and I'd like to thank everyone at EFI and the members of the expert panel who contributed to this report. On August 5th and 6th of this year, Don, the EFI team, and I convened 2 workshops on the topic of carbon mineralization. Now, carbon mineralization is another frontier of carbon dioxide removal. Much of the CO2 that we've been emitting into the atmosphere comes from the Earth's rock record, for instance, from combusting fossil energy sources. And what carbon mineralization seeks to do is to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it back in the Earth's rock record where it's most stable. So turning air into rocks again from whence they came. And so there were 24 participants in our workshops on carbon mineralization from diverse agencies, national laboratories, universities, and representatives from the minerals and geothermal energy industry where carbon mineralization is beginning to be piloted. We discussed a number of topics which are listed here, and I'll go through them briefly. And the presenters and discussion leaders are named along with their affiliations for your reference. We talked about foundational cross-cutting science and technology for the many implementation scenarios for carbon mineralization. We talked about the 2 main families of carbon mineralization options, which are ex situ or Earth's surface mineralization and in situ or subsurface mineralization. We discussed challenges and opportunities for large-scale deployment of carbon mineralization and life cycle assessment, techno-economic assessments, and regulatory frameworks that are needed for implementation. And we touched upon governance and legal concerns. And all of this is outlined in the EFI report. Next slide, please. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the different pathways for carbon mineralization. And this is just in a nutshell. There are a lot of different options embedded within each of the 5 pathways that I'll discuss. Now, most of the pathways that we're looking at in this diagram use magnesium and calcium rich silicate rocks, which are called mafic rocks and ultramafic rocks. Mafic rocks are calcium and magnesium rich rocks like basalt. Ultramafic rocks are highly magnesium rich rocks. Examples are periddotites and serpentinites. And these are the fastest weathering silicate rocks at our surface. Naturally, they remove about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere each year. So that's the natural rate. And what carbon mineralization technologies seek to do is to accelerate that natural rock weathering process that turns silicate rocks into a solid magnesium and calcium carbonate rock that stores carbon in a solid form on the long term. So I'm going to start with the ex situ or surface technologies, and I'm going to focus on 2 of them. There's enhanced weathering, which takes finely pulverized mafic and ultramafic rock, which scrubs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it spreads it out on land so it's more reactive to the atmosphere. Implementations of this enhanced weathering process include use of this finely pulverized rock as a fertilizer, a soil amendment in agricultural fields. It can be used in forestry soils. And there are tie-ins to ocean storage as well by spreading it out into riverbanks and in coastal areas. So you might have heard about the concept of green sand beaches. That's one implementation of enhanced weathering. So the carbon is stored in a solid mineral form and in alkalinity, which can increase the pH of waterways and help mitigate acidification. And it's also stored in biomass. So there can be co-benefits of increasing soil health and crop production. The other ex situ mineralization technique I'd like to talk about is mineralization of mine tailings and other industrial wastes, for instance, steel making slag. So heavy industries, including mining and steel making and other industries, produce billions of tons of reactive magnesium and calcium-rich silicate wastes every year. And much of this is not used. It ends up being stockpiled in vast waste storage facilities. There are opportunities to change industrial processes to embed carbon dioxide removal into them, to carbonate that waste, turning it into a mineral. And so there are co-benefits of valorizing a waste that generally isn't used, and there's a nascent industry developing that's turning that carbonated waste into aggregate and building materials. I'd like to move now to the in situ mineralization pathways. And it's important to point out here that the ex situ or surface mineralization pathways are a carbon capture and store mechanism. When we're thinking about mineralizing carbon in the subsurface, we need to add on a capture pathway. So we can use direct air capture, bioenergy CCS, or traditional point source capture, although it's not CDR. And so carbon dioxide is injected into exactly the same types of rocks we use at the surface for mineralization. So basalts and peritites, for instance, and it's injected as either a supercritical liquid or as carbon dioxide dissolved in water. And in the subsurface, for instance, onshore in basalts or offshore in seafloor basalts, or within subsurface peritites, we make magnesium and calcium carbonate minerals, which store the carbon on the long term. There's a fifth mechanism that crosscuts the ex situ and in situ technologies, and that's looping of magnesium and calcium. And so instead of starting with a magnesium and calcium silicate rock, we start with a magnesium or calcium carbonate rock. For instance, limestone, and I'm close to the Rocky Mountains, so that's an example of a limestone deposit or a dolostone deposit. And so you heat up that carbonate rock that's already storing carbon and capture the carbon, inject it into the subsurface, and then the reactive magnesium calcium rich material that's left over and carbon free will react at the surface of the earth with the atmosphere again. So you can collect more carbon, evolve it off, collect it, and inject it underground, recycling the magnesium and calcium rather than just using it once as in the other scenarios. Next slide, please. The key findings of the expert panel, which are detailed in the report, are that carbon mineralization provides a pathway to permanent isolation of CO2 from the environment. And we know that from studying the Earth's rock record as our scientists. Magnesium and calcium carbonate minerals can be stable on timescales of millions or billions of years. So that effectively solves the problem of storage. Technological enhancements to expand and accelerate the natural carbon mineralization process can make it feasible to achieve gigaton scale carbon dioxide removal. So again, natural rock weathering removes about 1 billion tons of CO2 per year from the atmosphere globally. And those technologically enhanced rock weathering processes that I described on the previous slide could get us to a rate of 5 times to 10 times the natural rate by enhancing natural existing processes. Carbon mineralization has co-benefits that are important to explore and can enhance its attractiveness. So of course the core benefits have to be combating climate change, and it offers permanent carbon storage. But there are opportunities, for instance, synergies with other CDR and CCUS methods. Carbon mineralization is flexible, so we can use it modularly with DAC or BECCS, for instance. There's the possibility of using enhanced weathering to fertilize and improve soil health and crop yields, which has been demonstrated in a few trials to date. And there are opportunities to embed environmental benefits into heavy industry with waste utilization, as well as upcycling wastes to use as building materials. And carbon mineralization draws upon an existing industry knowledge base and existing infrastructure. Agriculture, forestry, and mining are some of the oldest technologies that we have. Next slide, please. So getting to the most important part, the recommendations of the expert panel, which are detailed in the report once again, are for increased federal investment in carbon mineralization RD&D. And the report recommends that this include a portfolio of those 5 major mineralization pathways that are described on the previous slide for in situ and ex situ carbon mineralization and cross-cutting technologies. And each of those pathways has the potential to reach gigaton scale carbon dioxide removal within a cost range of less than $100 per ton of CO2. And so just briefly, that's surface carbonation of mineral wastes, enhanced rock weathering, surface capture of CO2 via magnesium calcium looping, and subsurface injection of CO2 into ultramafic and mafic rocks, and hybrid approaches that combine DAC or BECCS or other technologies for capture with subsurface injection and mineralization. Next slide, please. And so the 5 take-home messages amongst the recommendations are that we need larger scale pilots. So echoing what Brad said earlier for the oceans, we need to test the technical and economic feasibility of ex situ and in situ carbon mineralization pathways that have shown promising results. And some of those pathways are already being tested at the pilot scale, but many of them need to be scaled up from where they currently are at the 1 ton to 10 ton scale to get up to the 1,000 ton scale and then implementation. So that's a major outcome of our findings. And we recommend that there be establishment of a regional carbon mineralization testing site network with government, industry, university partnerships. And the model from the DOE regional carbon sequestration partnerships and carbon safe programs is a good one to adopt because different regions of the United States have different climates, different rock types, different industries, and different access to the ocean. So solutions will be different depending on where you are. The co-benefits of carbon mineralization need to be explored in more detail because they have potential benefits for users and communities where these projects are utilized. We also need new methodologies for techno-economic analysis, life cycle assessments, and for monitoring, reporting, and verification to enable large-scale deployment and accounting of carbon dioxide removal. And finally, we need policy alignment for gigaton scale deployment, for instance, clarification of permitting requirements for mineralization projects and eligibility for the 45Q tax credit. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha. That was very helpful, and we appreciate that. And so I'd like to kind of keep the process moving forward. So we'll switch now to the third presentation, and this will be on biological and terrestrial carbon dioxide removal. And this group was co-chaired by Ari Petrinos and Stan Wolfschlager. And Ari is going to provide the presentation today. Ari has a very long and very distinguished career spanning both academia, industry, and government. He's currently the chief scientist at the Novim Group, and he also serves as a visiting scholar at New York University. He has a very long career, and I think the other thing I would just highlight was that early in his career, he spent a number of years as the director of the Biological and Environmental Research Program in the Department of Energy Office of Science, where he was one of the leaders of the U.S. Global Change Science Program, and now is bringing that expertise and experience to carbon dioxide removal. So with that, Ari, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe, for this kind introduction. And I want to thank EFI and the sponsors for making this study and this report happen. I also wish to acknowledge my colleague and co-lead Stan Wolfschlager from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, who has been a colleague of mine in several other activities as well. The terrestrial biosphere plays a major role in carbon exchange with the atmosphere, and with photosynthesis, a major process. In this particular study, we wanted to explore how plant cultivars and forests can be made to increase the carbon dioxide removal that it currently is responsible for. We convened a workshop last April with 23 thought leaders from diverse agencies, universities, and institutions, and we addressed 2 categories, cultivars and forests. We had facilitators for the various activities, such as the settling the stage, the traits of interest, technical approaches, ethical and social considerations, which we feel is a very important one. These various foci will be presented in greater detail at the report. Our key findings, there are 5 that we identified. There are actually a few more than 5, but these are the principal ones. The first one being that innovations across several areas of science and technology open the door to new pathways for biological and terrestrial carbon dioxide removal. The importance here is innovations in biotechnology, large-scale data management, and artificial intelligence all have the potential to, in fact, supercharge the amounts of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, from both agricultural and forestry lands. The second finding was that the biological and terrestrial carbon dioxide research portfolio should emphasize soil organic carbon replenishment and storage, and development of new strains of plants and trees with greater carbon absorption abilities. The specific R&D that we identified, and I guess more detail in the report, that is needed on gene identification, target trait improvement, and biotechnologies that can in fact accelerate these breakthroughs. In this particular figure, we show a plant that has been improved for increased photosynthetic efficiency, more CO2 uptake, basically, but also for other benefits, such as reduced water and nutrient needs, deeper and thicker roots, and others as well. In terms of the third finding, there is no question in our minds, basically, that CDR can also produce significant co-benefits. Biological and terrestrial CDR complements in many ways other agricultural objectives, such as improved soil health and yields, reduced resource needs, and new revenue streams for farmers. The fourth key finding, we found that it's important that biological and terrestrial CDR should proactively address the ethical, legal, and social challenges associated with biotechnology innovation. I cut my teeth on these LC issues, so to speak, in the Human Genome Project, and I find that addressing those hard and fast and early are the only way we can deal with essentially the problems that could emerge if we neglect them. We believe that compliance with current federal and international regulations should adequately address these particular concerns. Last but not least, in terms of findings, the fifth one was that policy actions will be needed to address cross-cutting challenges facing soil-based carbon dioxide removal. This pictorial basically shows the combination of data and models, providing, in a sense, a scalable quantification platform that can feed into such things as national policies, international commitments, regional natural outputs, as well as things like farm local level outputs dealing and leading into financial supply chains and incentive programs. In terms of the data, we're referring to remote sensing, both with satellites and drones, for example, dealing with crop species, management practices, productivities, etc. Spatial data such weather, topography, and soils, and of course the land manager input, the additional management information. In terms of the models, things such as soil monitoring networks that are used for model validation, as well as long-term experiments that provide essentially the effects that feed into this model development. The Academy back in 2018 concluded that modeling and monitoring tools will be crucial to the scale-up of soil-based carbon dioxide removal methods, as also will be shown in this particular report. We have four basic conclusions. The first one being that scientific advances in biotech in the coming decade will lead to contributions to carbon dioxide removal that would be about similar to those that clean energy touts. The second one is that significant investments in trait identification and improvement, biotechnology, and scale-up experiments in both agriculture and forestry lands will be absolutely necessary. Fourth, the substantive, multidisciplinary, and international collaborations should be aggressively pursued. And last but not least, in the US at least, significant interagency coordination with USDA in a central role would accelerate reaching the carbon dioxide removal goals. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ari, and I appreciate that. And then basically, we do have some time here, so which is great, so we can get some of the questions from the audience today. So I'm going to turn it over back to Sam Savitz, who has been collecting questions, and let him fire away.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all our co-leads for your valuable contributions to the report and your presentations today. So I'm going to start off. One questioner highlighted that the European Union plans to spend $90 billion on getting to carbon neutrality. So can all three of you speak more broadly about international collaboration and how it might be key to scaling up CDR, RD&D in your area, as well as specific collaboration that may be done with European countries, since I know we highlighted that, for example, in the Oceans report.
Well, maybe I'll just start then, Sam. Yeah, we definitely highlighted the need and opportunity for international collaboration. And in fact, we had members of a project called Ocean Nets, Negative Emission Technologies, on our panel. And that is a pretty significant program in the EU to really develop and test ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. But we need to go beyond the European and US collaborations to include China and the Pacific and other countries. The oceans are clearly an international commons and birthright of humanity, and we need to work on this together. And I think there's enormous opportunity to do that.
I'm happy to add a little bit onto that, because there is a relationship again with mineralization and seafloor basalts. So there would need to be international collaboration if we're going offshore for certain. Anything with the oceans will have to be international. In terms of mineralization, it will often depend on regional expertise and industry. For instance, collaboration amongst agricultural industries and mining industries and the geothermal energy industry internationally is going to be important for the development of pilot projects and implementation of mineralization. So more international collaboration is better.
Well, I echo the comments that my colleagues made here. If you recall, we made one of the four conclusions of our study, the substantive international collaborations, that without them, this goal will fall short. And certainly the European Union would be one of the major partners, but also other countries as well. And in fact, we are in discussions with our colleagues in China, especially through the Beijing Genome Institute, to work together on this carbon dioxide removal processes, using, again, the modern tools of genomics and all the other related omics. We hope to have that sometime in the middle of next year.
All right, thanks for that. So we've also had a couple of questions on both measurement technologies for CDR and on modeling technologies. So we highlighted both of those in all three of our reports. Could each of you talk a little bit about sort of the state of those technologies and what some of the needs are in terms of getting them ready for prime time, so to speak?
Do you want to go in the same order?
Sure,
This is
sure.
one where I'd love my co-chair to speak, but I tried to answer one of the questions in the chat, which is for ocean-based pathways, the measuring technologies are going to be different by pathway. And in some cases, very sophisticated. In other cases, it's more of a direct function of the carbon stored in biomass. But the detail of measuring the carbon dioxide removal and permanence and storage of the other pathways, well, especially the alkalinization pathway, is a very complex process that is going to take a fair amount of effort and investment.
You want me to go next?
Sure, all right, let's go ahead.
Okay. Well, I did show it, at least in that pictorial graph, the importance of the combination of both the modeling as well as the measurement technologies. With respect to measurements in the terrestrial biosphere, the improvements or the advances have been really extremely fast and pretty rigorous in recent years, especially moving very much from the macroscopic to the microscopic, especially using the tools of molecular biology and also the tools of automation. So we've seen essentially a significant jump in the sophistication of the measurements that we currently can take in ecosystems that may have relevance and significant weight in the actual measurement and the quality of the measurements. With respect to modeling, that's another area where advent of supercomputing, as well as the incorporations of things as machine learning and artificial intelligence, are giving a significant boost in our ability to combine the more sophisticated measurements and come up with results and iterations that would be very, very valuable in terms of providing quantitative estimates of carbon dioxide removal systems.
We have fantastic tools that have been developed for in situ carbon mineralization in basalts, and that's been developed by the CarbFix team. So there are very robust estimates and modeling strategies available for injection and mineralization at depth. At the surface, again, it depends on where you're storing the carbon. If you can reliably store it in a closed facility, for instance, with industrial wastes, you can measure that mineralization on a landscape scale very robustly using existing techniques. Again, when you're working with the split between carbon stored in minerals, in alkalinity, and in the biosphere, it becomes more complex. So we're going to need a lot of innovation in that space. And ultimately, I think from the mineralization perspective, and perhaps it cross-cuts with the other technologies, we need faster and easier strategies for this. For instance, I know in my field, eddy flux measurements for carbon dioxide drawdown from the atmosphere, and trying to develop satellite tools for measurement are something that people are starting to work on.
Thanks for that. And I just want to mention, Sasha mentioned the CarbFix project, which someone else brought up in comments. That's a project in Iceland. That's one of the largest scale demonstration projects for mineralization to date. I recommend for maybe some younger people on the call checking out the episode about them on Zac Efron's Netflix show. And so on to the next question. We had a couple of questions about carbon credit systems and what might be required, for example, to get mineralization credits under the 45Q tax credit system in the US, or in general, getting carbon credits for any of these technologies under something like the European ETS, California's cap and trade system, anything like that. And let's start with Brad again.
Well, first, I think it's going to be absolutely necessary to have a vibrant and growing carbon market if we're going to make any of this work. So that was almost a precondition in our report for the success of a number of these technologies, is there has to be a reasonable price on carbon and there has to be a growing market. And you have to have verifiable methods to show what the carbon storage and permanence of that storage is from ocean-based approaches. So you need Vera type standards or gold standards developed for each of the ocean-based carbon dioxide removal pathways so that they can play on a fair playing field in the carbon market. That's an absolute imperative.
Ari, do you want to go next?
Sure. Like Brad said, if we don't have a carbon market, this is dead on arrival, dead on departure. The other issue is, he also raised it, which is also very relevant for terrestrial CDR, is the rigor of the measurements. If you can't trust the measurements, then this again will not succeed. So we are encouraged, as I mentioned earlier, with the technologies that have been developed for measurements, as well as the improved modeling systems that can provide confidence in policymakers to essentially sign on to an agreement that will put value to carbon and also in many ways accomplish a fair and effective market.
I'm calling in from Canada, so we do have a carbon tax and a market up north, and we're at $30 a ton of CO2 right now, and that will go up to $50 in 2 years. But in terms of getting the verification standards, I can only echo absolutely what you've said, Brad and Ari. We need to have those standards in order for there to be a motivation for people to do it. And having an international market where all the markets join up would really be a big driving force, I think.
Sam, I'm just going to intervene here. We have about a minute or two left, so one final question, and then we'll need to move on.
Yeah. All right. So for the last question, we had a couple that mentioned this as well, which is ways that you could get industry, not just the federal government, involved in these CDR technologies. And we talk about this in the reports as well, but things like agriculture and pharmaceutical industries for the terrestrial side, mining and steel industries on the mineralization side, and various maritime industries for oceans. How can we create better collaboration there between sort of research and industry?
Maybe very quickly, we are currently developing roadmaps for ocean carbon dioxide removal that follow the exact pathways laid out in the report. Those roadmaps have very specific, detailed outcomes that need to happen and things that need to be done. And we're working very closely with industry on places where they can be involved. But as you point out, there is an ample overlap between marine industries and marine CDR, and a lot of really good opportunity. You can read about some in the report and some at oceanvisions.org, the CDR project.
Well, I'm encouraged from what I have seen over the last couple of years in terms of the private sector's interest in entering this particular domain and making a significant effect, both domestically as well as internationally. And I mean, it goes without saying that governments need to support this kind of thing, not necessarily with funding for the private sector, but with the appropriate policy instruments that will facilitate their becoming competitive in the marketplace.
I can speak to some of the early adopters of carbon mineralization. We've seen that adopted by the CarbFix project, for instance, in geothermal energy as a way to mitigate emissions. We've also seen it beginning to be adopted in the mining industry as a way to mitigate emissions, and also for some of the co-benefits of immobilizing metals, for instance, in carbonate minerals. And also as a, for instance, it's being adopted in some of the mining industry as a way to improve consumer confidence and improve the social license to operate. In soils, adoption of carbon mineralization has occurred because of the benefits to farmers in terms of crop yield.
Thank you. All right, we're going to have to stop it here. Sam, thanks for moderating those Q's and A's. I think that was some very interesting discussion, but we now hopefully have some even more interesting discussion as we move on to a kind of a panel discussion. And let me introduce Michael Korn, who's going to lead that effort. Michael is a San Francisco-based reporter for Quartz, which is a business publication where he covers the people, companies, and technologies addressing climate change. Michael has a very interesting background that he brings to this, combining both journalism and environmental science and economics. And so he's a real expert who's done some very thoughtful work on CDR. And we're very delighted that he was able to join us today to lead this discussion. So Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you for the next leg of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And thanks everybody for joining. So we've just assembled a really great group to talk through the future of carbon dioxide removal in the Biden-Harris administration, which is something I'm sure we're all interested in. So I'll introduce the group, and we'll give some brief summaries of that work, and then open it up to Q&A. And feel free to add your questions at any time, and I'll work that into the discussion. So just to frame it up, we all know that we need to remove gigatons of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by 2050 to avoid more serious warming. And the Energy Futures Initiative has proposed spending about $10.7 billion over 10 agencies to jumpstart the R&D process. And so far, Congress hasn't allocated very much for that. That's likely to change under the Biden-Harris administration. They've proposed spending about $1.7 trillion on this, and it is the most ambitious plan of any candidate and now future occupant of the White House. But understanding where that's going to go and what will have the most impact is still like reading the tea leaves. The plan is a little short on details about what will receive money and is focused more on emission reductions. And so that'll be the focus here is what can we do, what can the administration do, and how do we achieve this both through technology and social acceptance. So we'll start with Scott Doney, He's a professor on the Environmental Sciences faculty at the University of Virginia, specializing in oceanography, climate, and biochemistry. And his work answers questions about how the ocean ecology responds to climate change and ocean acidification. And that's taken him to Antarctica at the Palmer Long-Term Ecological Research Station, as well as to working with machine learning models on global data sets. So Scott, would you like to give us a quick overview?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. As you said, my background is in ocean chemistry and carbon cycle. So I've done a fair amount of work trying to understand what the uptake from natural processes is of the ocean of anthropogenic carbon dioxide, and the implications in terms of ocean acidification and how that affects ecosystems and coastal communities. More recently, in terms of the CDR space, we've been working with colleagues here at UVA and engineering and the policy school, trying to look at how the different carbon dioxide removal approaches mesh together in terms of economic impacts, life cycle analysis impacts, trade-offs in terms of resource use and environmental footprints. And so we've been doing that in terms of life cycle analysis and integrated assessment models. So that's sort of a quick summary of what we've been up to recently.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Scott. And next is Leslie Jantarasamy. So she has perhaps the hardest job in the room. She helps direct energy climate efforts at the Bipartisan Policy Center, bringing together Republicans and Democrats on critical issues. So she has 10 years of experience working at the state and federal levels, including EPA and State Department. And she recently worked on decarbonizing Oregon's electricity, transportation, and industrial sectors, as well as carbon pricing legislation. So Leslie, would you give us a quick overview?
Make sure you. Thank you so much, Michael.
Sure.
The Bipartisan Policy Center is a Washington, D.C. based think tank, so a little slightly different from, I guess, the rest of my panelists here, which are mostly from universities, but we are focused on actively fostering durable bipartisan solutions to critical public policy challenges facing our country. And BPC's energy project is focused on advancing evidence-based, economically viable policy solutions to the transition to a competitive and net zero carbon economy. So we're kind of taking this all of the above approach to addressing climate change. We're very much in support of the idea that carbon dioxide removal strategies are needed alongside concerted efforts to avoid and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have 3 ongoing initiatives that relate to carbon dioxide removal, both natural and technology-based. Our American Energy Innovation Council consists of corporate leaders and is dedicated to promoting clean energy innovation. Our Direct Air Capture Advisory Council includes industry, business, and policy leaders working to advance direct air capture technology. And then our recently launched Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Initiative focuses on natural carbon removal through land-based strategies that also create economic opportunities for rural and farm communities. And because I co-lead this effort for BPC, I'll be focusing today on these natural CDR pathways.
Great. Thank you. And Jennifer Wilcox is the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. She's developing mitigation and adaptation strategies to minimize negative climate impacts. Most of her work's been funded by the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, as well as the private sector. And she was well ahead of most of her field by publishing a textbook on carbon capture in March 2012. So do you want to give us a quick overview?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for having me. A lot of the work that we're doing more recently is focused on what Sasha talked about earlier, which is CO2 mineralization. So a big question is, with mineralization in particular, is where does the alkalinity come from in order to get to the scale we need? So gigatons, say, by mid-century. And so a lot of the work we're looking at is dealing with the mining sector and looking at waste materials from mining, in particular nickel, and copper and palladium and platinum. When you mine these materials, you're already spending the grinding energy. And so we're looking at the tailing waste in particular, which tends to be rich in magnesium and calcium. And it's interesting because when you look at all of the different types of alkalinity, the reactivity with CO2 is varied. And so in our group, what we're trying to do is engineer processes such that we can look at different routes to getting that reactivity enhanced, so that we can actually look at using more of these waste tailings to have an impact. So a lot of our work couples to life cycle assessment and looking at the carbon flows into the system and also techno-economic analysis to figure out what the costs are going to be. Ultimately, in the end, it's a newer idea of actually, permanently removing CO2 through this process rather than the conventional, which is thinking about storage in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And then the question is what do you do with the synthetic aggregate once you produce it? And some of the things that we're looking at is either using it as a remediation strategy, like abandoned coal mines, or even waste asbestos mines. And then also using it as a feedstock potentially for the construction industry, like in concrete. And so that's some of the work that we're doing and focusing on.
Great. And Colin McCormick, he teaches AI policy and environmental sensing at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. During the Obama administration, he served as a senior technical advisor at the US DOE, and he was focused on coordinating different applied energy efforts. So he has a degree in astrophysics and English and a PhD in atomic and optical physics from the University of California. So tell us a little bit about your work.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, so wearing multiple hats here today. So we talked briefly about my previous work at Department of Energy. I was there during the ARRA boom, where we spent an absolutely enormous amount of money. One of the things I've done a lot of thinking about recently is if we're in for a large spending increase in the federal government and CDR, how can we do that well? How can we coordinate that well across the various agencies? You heard from Joe Hezir earlier on the clearing the air report that I was also closely involved in, and we thought very carefully about that. The number of disciplines, the number of federal agencies that need to be involved in this is very large. And maybe we'll get into some questions about how we can best coordinate that. I'll make one other comment. I'm also now serving as the Chief Innovation Officer at Carbon Direct. We're a carbon removal investment and advisory firm. And in that role, we've been advising private companies that are interested in buying negative emissions. We've learned a lot about the struggles and challenges that private purchasers face when they come to this looking for a market that is much more commoditized and mature than it actually is. So maybe we can talk about that too.
All right, so we have a lot to discover. So let's start with the first one. And I think that's what everyone's wondering is, so what is the one thing that you think the Biden administration can do to have the biggest impact on CDR research and deployment in the next 4 years, perhaps longer? I'm going to let anyone take that, or I'll assign it to you. Colin probably has an answer. He's been there before.
I'll start off with one. So, I mean, the first thing is showing leadership. I think everyone is clear on this, but really showing that this is going to happen. This matters. That these investments are going to be made by the federal government. That we're in this and we're going to do this. I think there's an immense power in showing that leadership to the private sector that helps ignite and catalyze a lot of investment there. There's a long list of other things, but you only asked for the top one. So.
That's right. And you raise a good point, which is what is going to be the role of the private sector? I think programs like NASA have shifted definitively towards a public-private partnership model, and that may or may not be appropriate here. But how do you see your work in terms of developing and scaling up these technologies?
Well, I'll say one thing about that. There is a lot of excitement about the private sector, a lot of companies that have committed to net zero emissions who are going to need CDR technologies. I want to caution that is still very early, and the total dollars that those companies are currently prepared to put into developing and buying these technologies is extremely small. So we absolutely need major federal investment to make this move. So I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of the private sector role here.
Jennifer, I think your work particularly has a lot of intersection with large-scale mining and other industrial companies. What do you see their role in solving some of those problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at mining, there's wastes associated with that, and some of it's stockpiled. And so looking at opportunities where they can couple that with CO2, and you're mitigating two wastes, both that from the mining industry, but also the CO2. The question is, where do you get the CO2? If you're getting it from the atmosphere, then it's a carbon removal. But if you're getting it from a voided source, what you're doing is you're actually helping to decarbonize potentially a supply chain, whether that's the power sector or whether it's cement or steel. It's still something that needs to happen. There are industries that are really difficult to decarbonize today, like some of the industrial industries. And so this method is also an approach to try and decarbonize those supply chains.
This was a question that was raised in the Q&A, was about the role of the oil and gas industry, although you could apply other applications. It seems like, and Leslie, maybe you can talk about this, that having the private sector play a large role, and especially oil and gas industry in terms of those tax credits and other types of benefits, has been a sort of point of consensus around early action on CDR. Do you see that as being something which is actually going to be potential moving forward, or do you think there are other areas that should be focused on?
So I was also going to jump in with a kind of slightly different answer to the question around, private sector relationships with CDR investments in the world of natural CDR. And what we're really focused on is kind of the really land-based, the farms and the forest-based solutions. And so, for example, we're talking about restoring trees to lands that were once forested, or afforestation to cultivate new forest. Increased, cover cropping or conservation tillage to increase soil health and reduce soil disturbance, or restoration of native grasslands. And so these types of activities require, at least in the United States, heavy participation from private actors, whether or not they are corporations that are involved in agriculture or in the forest products industry, kind of the timber industry, or whether we're talking just about individual farmers or individual forest landowners that are making decisions about what they want to do on their own lands. And so it's kind of a unique wrinkle, of the challenge for nature-based solutions here, is that it really relies on kind of the willingness of these participants to employ these practices. And I think what's been missing thus far, and kind of when we're thinking about the ability of these practices to kind of reach a scale that is meaningful for climate change, is that there are not yet market or kind of policy drivers that are creating the economic incentive for these private landowners to take the actions that we think that have the best ability to sequester more carbon. And so what relates to what we were saying earlier about just there's some questions around quantification. There are challenges related to measurement and monitoring of carbon on the landscape, and so the markets still need to be developed in this area. And
do you see a bipartisan appetite to develop those markets right now?
We do. We see a lot of interest in how do we work with rural communities and with farmers and foresters to leverage the ability of these practices to scale up and provide not only benefits to kind of crop productivity or to forest productivity, but also to think about the monetization of the carbon benefit of these practices. And so it is about can we do both with these?
And to zoom out a little, Scott, did you have something?
Well, I just want to, I just want to look from the ocean perspective, because the report that EFI produced, they're quite different techniques that are all lumped into the ocean. Biological techniques that have some commonality with things on land. Then there's geochemical techniques that also have commonality. But one of the major concerns is that it's a moving fluid, and so it raises challenges of ownership. You have most of the ocean is a commons, unlike private held land. What you do in the ocean is much harder to monitor, because you do something in one spot and it has effects downstream. And it may be that your actions aren't actually as effective as you think, because you do something in one spot, but that actually counteracts, say, a carbon uptake in another location.
Okay.
And we have a lot of issues about how we developing a framework, both nationally and internationally, in terms of developing an ethical, environmental, and social justice framework for doing these experiments. And many of our international partners are blocked from doing some of these experiments because of concerns about doing this kind of work in international waters. And I really don't think we could go forward with pilot scale experiments without really having that discussion, which will require internal and external leadership.
Yeah, that raises a great point. So I think, the technological challenges are there, but they're clearer. The social challenges and the political capital needed to actually execute on them is maybe equal or even larger. What projects have you seen that you find have actually gone through a process which gains social acceptance, wins over sort of the political establishment, that are a model going forward? Or have you not seen those?
Well, I'll say something. I mean,
Sure.
on the ocean side, some of the ocean fertilization approaches that Brad mentioned, I have seen a lot of pushback. I mean, there's been a lot of hype about the co-benefits of these experiments and a lot of potential hype about the actual effectiveness, and a lot of concern both within the US and abroad about whether we fully understand the environmental consequences of these this type of work, particularly if done at scale. So I'd say that's maybe a test case
of how
study
not to do it.
How not to do it.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of maybe in the Q&A, a number of people have mentioned microalgae on shore, in desert areas, indoor farming, a number of other applications. What are the most promising from a technological point of view pilot projects that you've already seen developed? Colin, do you have one?
Or is in the oceans context or broadly?
No, actually across the CDR context.
Well, I think there's many of these, and they do get tangled up in the sort of, are they utilization, are they storage? You know, we've certainly seen stuff with small investment from some of the private sector leaders out there, things that do macroalgae production and sinking, looking at some mineralization thinking, some early direct air capture, obviously. So a wide range of this, some biomass conversion projects. There's a lot of these that are at that kind of early stage. The sheer heterogeneity of them poses this challenge. They're all lumped as carbon removal, but no single person understands all of them or even the majority of them. So I want to reemphasize how complicated this is and how much coordination and how big and diverse of a team we're going to need to really get our hands around it. And if I can, I want to make one other comment. I think Leslie's observation earlier about bipartisan opportunities is absolutely right. And I really hope we get creative about things like Jen talked about where are we going to get alkalinity, where are we going to get the actual minerals. There are a lot of mining communities in this country that sure would benefit from some economic subsidies to produce particular kinds of minerals that are relevant for these climate goals. That's the kind of bipartisan opportunity and creative thinking where you could get a more conservative community for a climate purpose joined in a creative policymaking. So I'd love to see some more thinking along those lines.
True. When I do interviews asking folks in Washington, D.C., what is the potential of a lot of these projects, it almost always comes back to how many jobs will it create. And inevitably, and I am no longer surprised, but it makes sense. How, when you talk about carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removal generally, should this be framed, both for policymakers and for the larger community? Because I think it still inspires a lot of either controversy or fear or misunderstanding.
Well, I think for the ocean, one of the ways that's been talked about is that, and I think now I can't remember who mentioned this. On long time scales, the ocean is going to be the sink of most of this human release carbon dioxide. It's going to get dissolved in the ocean. It's going to weather rocks on land, and that carbon's eventually going to get deposited in the deep sea. And so to the extent that you are accelerating natural processes that are already going to be scrubbing carbon dioxide out, as long as we can do it in an ethical and environmentally sustainable way, that's a benefit, because we're not creating we're not creating an alternative process. We're just accelerating natural processes. So I think that's one way of framing the discussion. But of course, the other thing is it's much better to not release a ton of carbon to the atmosphere than it is to suck it up later. So that's the other part of the conversation.
And Leslie, when you walk into a Hill office and talk to the staffers or the member, what is your elevator pitch?
Well, I think that what we're really focused on is the economic opportunity for rural America that's inherent in when we're talking about land-based carbon solutions, and particularly the farm and forest way here. And that what's great is that these practices aren't new. Like we're really building on the understanding of foresters and producers across the land to identify ways that they can make additional, revenue streams out of practices that already provide, not only, the crop productivity benefits, but also drought resilience, wildlife habitat. So kind of pooling together all of the different ways that these practices, create improvements across the landscape. I think that's really how we're identifying the way to overcome, at least in the near term, the lack of a robust market for carbon storage services. And so when I say we're interested in markets, it's not just climate related markets. It's also wood products and kind of innovation around how we're using wood, and how do we keep natural landscapes and working landscapes as forested landscapes and as farms. And one of the greatest threats really to some of the carbon storage that we have currently on the land is land conversion. Mm-hmm. The problems related to additional pressures. We see this globally too, with pressures of developing protected areas or other forested areas, and losing our ability to have natural and working lands as a carbon sink.
Great. Jennifer, I think this question came up in the Q&A as well, which is how are we going to fund all of this? And certainly government plays a role, and especially in the early stages. But in theory, or hopefully, the private sector will be able to take over much of that scale of funding to scale up a lot of these solutions. You probably know more about the physics and the economics of a lot of these things, since there's a lot of companies already involved in that supply chain. What do you see as sort of the baton pass between federal or state government and private financing for what you do?
Sure. Well, I think it's hard when you think of each of these technologies in a silo. So like when you look at direct air capture, for instance, and you see this broad range of costs, and it may today cost anywhere between $200 to $600 per ton that a company might be able to do it at. And that's per ton of CO2. But if you think about instead, what are you doing with the CO2? If you're injecting it into the earth and producing oil, maybe there's other value streams that you can gain by doing that, whether it's 45Q or whether it's the low carbon fuel standard that's out of California. So there are different, streams of revenue that can look into that. But the issue with that process and that enhanced oil recovery is that you're also producing new carbon that goes into the atmosphere from that process. And so there are other approaches, like one being, for instance, if you were to look at concrete and you look at coupling concrete, knowing that in concrete you have cement and you have sand and gravel. And so one of the approaches that we're looking at isn't just looking at what's the cost of avoiding the carbon emissions from the cement sector in isolation, which may be $50 per ton. And what's the cost of using direct air capture to create a synthetic aggregate to replace sand and gravel, which may be, if it's direct air capture, $200 to $600 per ton. Rather than looking at each of those in a silo, imagine putting them together to make the product in the end that you want increased value for because it's sustainable and has the potential to have carbon removal, which in that case would be concrete. And finding approaches and strategies that allow you to scale the carbon capture with a product that doesn't have, that other kind of baggage associated with it, with actually creating new fossil or new carbon into the atmosphere, I think could absolutely be interesting. And there's probably other approaches too, not just that concept of concrete, but probably other chemical approaches too.
And so building on that, it seems like we're going to have to make some very hard decisions between deployment and R&D, and to get something out as fast as possible, but also investing in basic research. And hopefully there will be no sort of conflict between those. But to reach our goals, how much should we be focusing on deployment right now for what seems to already work? And how much of this is about getting more basic science and fine tuning what we already have?
Yeah, I can mention a little bit about that. So I was on a team from the National Academy of Sciences where we released a report in 2019, and we talked about this, establishing a research agenda, and what are the government organizations that might be able to help with funding some of the strategies. And I would say that there's no simple answer. We have technologies that are available to be deployed today, and they exist, certainly in terms of avoiding carbon emissions, but also removing it from the atmosphere. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also focus on new technologies that might be able to do it better in the future. And so I really think that having a portfolio is important, but we do need to it feels like it's this next decade has to be focused on infrastructure and actually creating projects where we actually can see the deployment at the scale we need to in order to move down learning curves so that we can start to realize lower costs, when we actually really need to depend on them.
And this is about economics. So when I report on electric vehicles, the magic number is $100 per kilowatt hour. So once we hit that point, before we hit that point, honestly, electric vehicles will be cheaper over the total lifespan than a comparative conventional car. Is there a magic number for carbon removal on a broad scale or specifically in different verticals?
I think others can answer this too, Colin.
I'll make a quick comment on this. So many other
You can't agree on this one.
technologies like EVs have an existing service that they provide. Internal combustion engines provide transportation. So what you're doing in that case with EVs is you're providing the same service in a more sustainable, lower carbon way. Carbon removal generally doesn't have that fundamental comparison. Other than a small carbon dioxide merchant market for industrial purposes in EOR, we really don't sort of use it. Removing it isn't a service. This has been an externality that the economy has tolerated for centuries. So unfortunately, it doesn't have a comparison as cleanly as what you suggest. I do think anecdotally that numbers under $100 a ton make people not scared. Everyone would love numbers under $20 a ton, but that's, we're not going to have vast amounts at that anytime soon. So I think a magic number, not based on any particular comparison, but just general feel, is probably around 100.
And hopefully Leslie agrees with me. I think for some of the more biological approaches, some of these may go forward primarily for the co-benefits. So they're going to go forward to improve, habitat, rebuild soils, rebuild coastal wetlands, and they're going to have the benefit of either keeping carbon from being released or storing additional carbon. And so I think it's not just there's more to it than, sort of a direct CO2 per ton. You have to think about the wide range of co-benefits, particularly for some of these biological approaches.
I definitely agree with that point. I would just add too that, maybe I have a leg up because we already have government programs that, through the USDA are investing millions of dollars into soil conservation and, into forestry projects. So yes, it's all about adding that carbon lens to what is already occurring within government and to increase the emphasis and focus and making it a priority. I think, Colin already mentioned we just need more kind of coordination amongst government agencies that, each has a piece of what it takes, to really scale up these practices. And I think, particularly a role, that we see as a priority for the incoming administration is better coordination and improved data collection, because there are a lot of programs, there are a lot of existing programs that are, doing field trials, they're doing kind of state and federally funded demonstration projects, or we have, like I said, these conservation grant programs that put projects out on the landscape, but there's no aggregation back up to what did we learn through all of this, and how does that translate into our models that can help reduce risk for private market actors that want to buy these carbon credits, or for example. And so I think that data piece of it is really huge.
Thanks, everyone. I think we're out of time. Is that right, Sam?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'm going to pass this along.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. And I want to extend thanks to all the panel participants, all our presenters today. Also, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. The link to find all our reports should be in the chat right now. And we know that many questions didn't have a chance to be answered, so we will be saving all of that and forwarding them on to the individual presenters to have them follow up with you. And we'll also be sending out a link to all the participants to provide some feedback on the presentation and on the reports. So look for that in your inboxes. So that's about it. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.